Rebecca Martinez had been working as a special effects coordinator for Paramount Studios for 8 years, but she'd never encountered anything quite like director James Crawford. The man was a perfectionist to the point of obsession, and his latest project, a zombie apocalypse film called Dead Walk at Noon, was consuming every waking moment of her life. What started as an exciting opportunity to work on a big-budget horror film had quickly devolved into a nightmare of impossible demands and constant criticism. The trouble began 3 months into production when Crawford decided that the zombie makeup wasn't realistic enough. Rebecca had assembled a team of the industry's most talented makeup artists, created prosthetics that had won awards on previous films, and developed a color palette that made the undead look genuinely terrifying. But Crawford wasn't satisfied. "This looks like Halloween makeup," he'd sneered during a particularly brutal production meeting. "I want something that will make people genuinely believe these creatures could exist. I want audiences to have nightmares." Rebecca had tried to explain that there were practical limitations to what makeup could achieve, especially when dealing with hundreds of extras who needed to be transformed daily. The budget Crawford had approved wasn't sufficient for the level of detail he was demanding, and the timeline didn't allow for the extensive application process his vision required. "That's your problem, not mine," Crawford had replied coldly. "I hired you because you're supposed to be the best. If you can't deliver what I need, I'll find someone who can." The threat wasn't idle. Crawford had already fired 3 department heads who'd failed to meet his impossible standards. The film's costume designer had been replaced after Crawford decided the zombie clothing wasn't sufficiently deteriorated. The cinematographer had been dismissed when Crawford changed his mind about the lighting scheme for the 3rd time. Even the catering company had been fired when Crawford complained that the food wasn't appropriate for the film's dark tone. Rebecca found herself working 18-hour days, trying to perfect techniques that would satisfy Crawford's increasingly bizarre demands. He wanted the zombies to have a specific type of decay that would show differently depending on the lighting conditions. He insisted that each zombie have an individual backstory that would be reflected in their makeup, even though most would appear on screen for mere seconds. He demanded that the blood effects be made from organic materials because he believed artificial blood didn't photograph authentically. The breaking point came during a location shoot in downtown Los Angeles. Crawford had secured permits to film in Heritage Square, a busy public plaza surrounded by office buildings, restaurants, and shops. The scene called for a massive zombie attack during the lunch hour, with hundreds of extras in full makeup shambling through the crowds of real pedestrians and office workers. Rebecca had spent weeks preparing for the shoot, coordinating with the city's film commission, arranging for crowd control barriers, and ensuring that all the necessary safety measures were in place. She'd hired additional security, posted signs warning pedestrians about the film shoot, and distributed flyers to nearby businesses explaining what would be happening. But Crawford had other ideas. 2 days before the shoot, he called Rebecca into his trailer and announced that he was changing the entire concept. "I've been thinking about this scene," he said, pacing back and forth in the cramped space. "It's too predictable. The audience will know it's fake because they'll see the barriers and the cameras. I want something more authentic." "What do you mean by authentic?" Rebecca asked, though she was already dreading the answer. "I want to film it guerrilla style. No barriers, no warning signs, no obvious camera equipment. I want to capture real reactions from real people." Rebecca felt her stomach drop. "James, that's not possible. We can't send hundreds of people in zombie makeup into a crowded public space without proper crowd control. Someone could get hurt." "That's exactly why it will work. The fear will be genuine. The panic will be real. It'll be the most authentic zombie scene ever filmed. It's also completely illegal and incredibly dangerous. We'll lose our permits, the insurance company will never approve it, and we could face criminal charges." Crawford's expression hardened. "Rebecca, I'm going to explain something to you. This film is going to revolutionize the horror genre. It's going to be talked about for decades. But only if we're willing to push boundaries and take risks. If you're not up for that challenge, I can find someone who is." The threat was clear, but Rebecca had reached her limit. She'd compromised her professional standards, worked ridiculous hours, and endured months of abuse, all in the name of Crawford's artistic vision. But she wouldn't compromise public safety. "James, I can't support this plan. It's reckless and it's wrong." "Then you're fired," Crawford said without hesitation. "Clean out your trailer and be off the set by tonight. I'll handle the zombie effects myself." Rebecca left the trailer in shock. She'd been dismissed from projects before, but never for refusing to endanger innocent people. As she packed her equipment, she wondered if she should contact the authorities about Crawford's plan. But she had no proof of his intentions, and whistleblowing in Hollywood was a career-ending move. Instead, she decided to document everything. She copied all her correspondence with Crawford, saved every email detailing his demands, and created a detailed timeline of his increasingly erratic behavior. If something went wrong during the shoot, she wanted to make sure there was a record of her objections. What Rebecca didn't know was that Crawford had no intention of abandoning his guerrilla filming plan. He was determined to create the most shocking zombie scene in cinema history, and he didn't care who got hurt in the process. The stage was set for a disaster that would make headlines around the world, and Rebecca Martinez was about to become the unlikely hero who would expose the dangerous ego of a director who had lost all perspective on the difference between art and reality. Marcus Thompson stood in the crowded Heritage Square, checking his watch as he waited for his lunch meeting with a potential client. As a freelance marketing consultant, he'd grown accustomed to meeting clients in busy public spaces, but today something felt different. There was an unusual amount of activity around the square, with several unmarked vans parked along the perimeter and people with professional-looking equipment scattered throughout the area. He'd noticed the film permit notices posted around the square, but they'd been vague about the specific nature of the production. Marcus had worked with several entertainment companies in the past, so he understood that film shoots often required flexibility and discretion. Still, something about the setup made him uneasy. At exactly noon, as Marcus was reviewing his presentation notes, chaos erupted. The first zombie appeared from behind a food truck, stumbling into the crowd with a blood-curdling moan. Its makeup was so realistic that several people screamed and backed away in genuine terror. The creature's flesh appeared to be rotting off its bones, its clothing was torn and blood-stained, and its eyes had a milky, lifeless quality that made it look genuinely deceased. Within seconds, more zombies began emerging from various locations around the square. They poured out of the vans, shambled from behind buildings, and even climbed out of manholes that had apparently been opened for the production. The creatures moved with the characteristic zombie shuffle, but their makeup and costumes were so convincing that many people didn't immediately realize they were watching a film being made. Marcus watched in fascination as the elaborate scene unfolded. The zombies were incredibly well coordinated, moving through the crowd in a way that created maximum visual impact while still allowing civilians to move away safely. He spotted several cameras positioned around the square, some obviously professional equipment and others that appeared to be handheld devices operated by people dressed as ordinary pedestrians. But as the scene continued, Marcus began to notice problems. The crowd's reactions were too intense, too genuine. People weren't just acting surprised or amused by the film shoot, they were genuinely terrified. Children were crying, elderly people were struggling to get away from the zombies, and he could see several people on their phones, apparently calling for help. The situation escalated when one of the zombies, a tall man with particularly gruesome makeup, approached a group of tourists who were taking photos near the fountain. The tourists assumed he was part of the entertainment and began posing for pictures. But when the zombie grabbed one of the women and let out a realistic growl, she screamed and tried to pull away. What happened next would be replayed on news broadcasts around the world. The woman's husband, a large man in his 50s, apparently believed his wife was in genuine danger. He tackled the zombie, sending both of them crashing into the fountain. The zombie's makeup began washing off in the water, revealing the confused face of a young actor who was clearly unprepared for this level of physical confrontation. The incident triggered a panic. People began running in all directions, convinced that they were witnessing either a real attack or a dangerous situation that had spiraled out of control. The other zombies, seeing their colleague in distress, broke character and began trying to help, but their appearance only made the situation worse. Marcus pulled out his phone and began recording the chaos, his marketing instincts telling him that this was either a brilliant publicity stunt or a complete disaster. Within minutes, he could hear sirens approaching from multiple directions. Police cars, fire trucks, and ambulances were converging on Heritage Square, responding to dozens of emergency calls from panicked civilians. The film crew, apparently realizing that their guerrilla shoot had gone horribly wrong, began trying to restore order. People with clipboards and headsets emerged from their hiding places, shouting directions and attempting to corral the zombie extras. But the damage was done. The square was in chaos, emergency responders were arriving in force, and the whole situation was being broadcast live on social media by dozens of witnesses. Marcus watched as police officers, clearly confused by the scene, began trying to separate the zombies from the civilians. The officers had no idea what they were dealing with, and their attempts to maintain order only added to the confusion. Some of the zombie extras, still in full makeup and character, were reluctant to break the illusion even as they were being questioned by police. The situation reached peak absurdity when a news helicopter arrived overhead, apparently alerted by the social media posts and emergency radio chatter. The helicopter's cameras captured the full scope of the chaos, hundreds of people running through the square, dozens of zombies in various states of undress and makeup removal, emergency responders trying to establish a perimeter, and film crew members attempting to gather their equipment before it was confiscated. Marcus realized he was witnessing what might be the most spectacular failure in film production history. Someone had clearly made a series of terrible decisions that had led to this moment, and he suspected that the fallout would be extensive. As he continued recording, he began to piece together what had gone wrong and why. The film crew's attempts to create an authentic zombie attack had succeeded too well. The makeup was too realistic, the setting too convincing, and the lack of proper crowd control had created a genuinely dangerous situation. People had been injured, public resources had been wasted, and the production had almost certainly violated numerous laws and regulations. But Marcus also recognized that this disaster represented an opportunity. As someone who specialized in crisis management and public relations, he understood that the companies and individuals involved in this fiasco would need serious help to recover their reputations and avoid legal consequences. What he didn't know was that the disaster was far from over, and that his decision to document everything would soon make him a key figure in the most expensive lesson in film production ethics ever recorded. The aftermath of the Heritage Square incident unfolded with the inevitability of a train wreck. Within hours, video footage of the chaos was trending on every social media platform, news organizations were running special reports, and the Los Angeles Police Department was launching a full investigation into what they were calling one of the most irresponsible film productions in city history. Marcus Thompson found himself at the center of the media storm when his recorded footage became one of the most complete documentations of the disaster. News organizations were offering substantial sums for the rights to his video, and he was fielding calls from lawyers, journalists, and even documentary filmmakers who wanted to use his material. But Marcus was more interested in the human cost of the incident. He'd watched as elderly people were trampled in the panic, as children were separated from their parents in the confusion, and as emergency responders risked their lives responding to what they believed was a genuine crisis. 3 people had been hospitalized with injuries sustained during the chaos, and dozens more had been treated for panic attacks and minor injuries. The financial cost was equally staggering. The city estimated that the emergency response had cost over $200,000 in overtime pay, equipment deployment, and lost productivity. The Heritage Square business district had been shut down for the rest of the day, costing local merchants thousands of dollars in lost revenue. Several ongoing construction projects had been disrupted when emergency responders blocked access to the area. Marcus decided to use his professional skills to investigate exactly how this disaster had happened. He began by researching the film production company, Paramount Studios, and quickly discovered that the project had been plagued with problems from the beginning. Director James Crawford had a reputation for difficult behavior, but his previous films had been successful enough that studios continued to work with him. The breakthrough came when Marcus received an unexpected phone call from Rebecca Martinez, the special effects coordinator who had been fired from the project 2 days before the incident. Rebecca had seen Marcus's video footage on the news and wanted to share her side of the story. "I tried to stop this," she said during their meeting at a coffee shop near the studio. "I told Crawford that his plan was dangerous and illegal, but he wouldn't listen. He was so obsessed with creating something shocking that he lost sight of basic safety and common sense." Rebecca showed Marcus the extensive documentation she'd compiled during her time on the project. Email chains revealed Crawford's increasingly erratic demands, budget documents showed that he'd consistently exceeded approved spending limits, and production schedules demonstrated that he'd been pushing cast and crew to work unsafe hours. "The zombie makeup was my work," Rebecca explained. "I'm proud of the artistry, but I never intended for it to be used to deceive innocent people. Crawford took my designs and used them to create a genuinely dangerous situation." Marcus studied the evidence Rebecca had provided. The paper trail clearly showed that Crawford had planned the guerrilla filming approach despite objections from multiple department heads. He deliberately concealed his intentions from the city's film commission, lied to the insurance company about the nature of the shoot, and ignored safety protocols that had been established for public filming. "Rebecca, why didn't you report this to the authorities before the shoot?" "I considered it, but I had no proof that he would actually go through with it. I thought maybe firing me would make him reconsider, or that someone else on the crew would talk sense into him. I never imagined he'd actually put hundreds of people at risk." Marcus realized that Rebecca's story represented a crucial piece of the puzzle. She hadn't just been fired for refusing to participate in Crawford's scheme, she'd been dismissed for trying to prevent a disaster. Her professional reputation had been damaged for doing the right thing, while Crawford had been allowed to proceed with his reckless plan. "Rebecca, would you be willing to go public with this information? I'm scared about the impact on my career. Crawford has connections throughout the industry, and whistleblowing can be professional suicide in Hollywood. But people were hurt because of his decisions. Don't you think the public deserves to know the truth?" Rebecca considered the question for a long moment. "You're right. I can't let fear of career consequences prevent me from speaking up about something this serious." Marcus began working with Rebecca to organize her evidence and prepare her for the media attention that would inevitably follow. He also reached out to other crew members who had been involved in the production, many of whom had their own stories about Crawford's problematic behavior. The investigation revealed a pattern of reckless decision-making that extended far beyond the Heritage Square incident. Crawford had a history of endangering cast and crew members in pursuit of his artistic vision. On previous films, he'd required actors to perform dangerous stunts without proper safety equipment, had ignored environmental regulations during location shoots, and had consistently pushed production schedules beyond safe limits. What made the situation even more troubling was that Crawford's behavior had been enabled by a system that prioritized results over safety. Studio executives had overlooked his problematic methods as long as his films were profitable. Department heads had been afraid to challenge his authority because he had a reputation for destroying careers. Even the crew members who had raised concerns had been marginalized or dismissed. Marcus realized that this story was about more than just one director's ego. It was about an entire industry that had lost sight of its responsibility to protect both its workers and the public. The Heritage Square disaster was the inevitable result of a culture that rewarded risk-taking without considering the potential consequences. As Marcus prepared to release his investigation, he received another unexpected call. This time it was from Dr. Patricia Williams, a film studies professor at USC who had been following the story closely. "Mr. Thompson, I've been researching similar incidents in film history," she said. "What happened at Heritage Square isn't an isolated event. It's part of a troubling pattern of directors who believe their artistic vision justifies endangering others." Dr. Williams had compiled a database of film production incidents going back decades. The list included fatal accidents, environmental disasters, and numerous cases of cast and crew members being injured due to director negligence. In most cases, the directors had faced minimal consequences while the victims had struggled to recover from their injuries and trauma. The industry has a responsibility to prevent these incidents, Dr. Williams explained. But that won't happen until there are real consequences for directors who prioritize spectacle over safety. Marcus began to understand that his investigation had the potential to spark a much larger conversation about accountability in the entertainment industry. The Heritage Square disaster could become a catalyst for meaningful change, but only if the full truth was revealed and the responsible parties were held accountable. As he prepared to publish his findings, Marcus knew that he was about to make some powerful enemies. Crawford still had supporters in the industry, and challenging his actions would likely result in legal threats and professional retaliation. But the evidence was overwhelming, and the stakes were too high to remain silent. The zombie apocalypse that Crawford had created in Heritage Square was about to trigger a very different kind of uprising, one that would expose the dangerous culture of an industry that had forgotten its responsibility to protect both its workers and the public. The publication of Marcus Thompson's investigation sent shockwaves through Hollywood and beyond. The detailed expose, published simultaneously by the Los Angeles Times and shared across social media platforms, painted a damning picture of director James Crawford and the culture of reckless endangerment that had enabled the Heritage Square disaster. Within hours of the story's release, Crawford was trending on social media for all the wrong reasons. #Heritage Square Disaster and #ZombieGate became rallying cries for industry reform, and the footage Marcus had captured was being analyzed frame by news organizations around the world. The immediate response was swift and decisive. Paramount Studios announced that they were terminating their contract with Crawford and launching a full internal investigation into the production practices that had led to the incident. The Screen Actors Guild issued a statement condemning the director's actions and calling for stronger safety protections for performers. The city of Los Angeles revoked Crawford's filming permits and announced that he would be banned from shooting in city locations indefinitely. But Crawford wasn't going down without a fight. Within days of the story's publication, Marcus received a cease and desist letter from Crawford's attorneys, demanding that he retract his statements and remove all video footage from public platforms. The letter claimed that Marcus had defamed Crawford and violated copyright laws by publishing behind-the-scenes footage without permission. "They're trying to intimidate you," Rebecca Martinez told Marcus during a phone call. Crawford's lawyers are known for using aggressive tactics to silence critics. "But everything you published is documented and true." Marcus had anticipated legal challenges and had worked with a media attorney to ensure that his investigation was bulletproof. Every claim was supported by evidence, every quote was properly attributed, and the video footage he'd captured was clearly shot in a public space where he had every right to record. The legal threats backfired spectacularly. Rather than intimidating Marcus into silence, they drew even more attention to the story. Other media outlets began digging deeper into Crawford's history, and additional victims of his reckless behavior began coming forward with their own stories. Sarah Johnson, a stunt performer who had worked on Crawford's previous film, revealed that she'd been hospitalized after the director insisted on a dangerous sequence that hadn't been properly rehearsed. The incident had been covered up by the studio, and Sarah had been forced to sign a non-disclosure agreement to receive her medical benefits. "I've been silent for 2 years," Sarah said during a television interview. "But after seeing what happened at Heritage Square, I realized that my silence was enabling him to hurt other people." Michael Davis, a cinematographer who had been fired from Crawford's film 6 months earlier, shared emails showing that Crawford had demanded dangerous shots that would have required camera operators to work in unstable conditions. When Michael had refused to put his crew at risk, he'd been replaced and blacklisted from other projects. The stories began to paint a picture of a director who had built his career on the backs of people who were too afraid to speak up. Crawford had used his position of power to coerce cast and crew members into dangerous situations, then relied on non-disclosure agreements and industry connections to silence anyone who objected. But the most damaging revelation came from an unexpected source. Dr. Patricia Williams, the film studies professor who had been researching industry safety issues, revealed that Crawford had been the subject of multiple complaints to the Directors Guild over the past decade. The complaints had been filed by various crew members and performers, but they'd been dismissed or buried by Guild officials who were reluctant to take action against a successful director. The system is designed to protect directors, not the people who work for them, Dr. Williams explained during a press conference. Crawford's behavior was an open secret in Hollywood, but nobody was willing to hold him accountable until innocent civilians were put at risk. The revelation that industry organizations had been aware of Crawford's problematic behavior but had failed to act triggered a new wave of outrage. Protesters gathered outside the Directors Guild headquarters, demanding transparency and accountability. The Guild's leadership found themselves facing calls for resignation and reform. Marcus watched the unfolding drama with a mixture of satisfaction and concern. He'd succeeded in exposing Crawford's dangerous behavior, but the director's powerful connections were mobilizing to protect him. Reports began circulating that Crawford was planning to sue not just Marcus, but everyone who had spoken out against him. The situation escalated when Crawford held a press conference of his own, accompanied by a team of high-powered attorneys. He denied all accusations of wrongdoing and claimed that he was the victim of a coordinated smear campaign by disgruntled former employees and opportunistic media figures. "I am an artist who has dedicated my life to creating compelling entertainment," Crawford said, reading from a prepared statement. The Heritage Square incident was an unfortunate accident that has been blown out of proportion by people who have their own agendas. "I will not be silenced by false accusations and character assassination." Crawford's lawyers announced that they were filing lawsuits against Marcus, Rebecca, and several other individuals who had spoken out against the director. They claimed damages in the millions of dollars and demanded that all video footage and documentation be turned over to the court for review. The legal threats created a chilling effect throughout the industry. Other potential witnesses began backing away from their stories, afraid of being caught up in expensive litigation. Some of the crew members who had initially supported Marcus began receiving pressure from their agents and employers to distance themselves from the controversy. But Crawford had underestimated the determination of the people he was trying to intimidate. Marcus had spent his career helping companies navigate public relations crises, and he understood that the key to surviving Crawford's attacks was to stay on the offensive. "This is exactly what we expected," Marcus told a gathering of supporters at a downtown Los Angeles restaurant. "Crawford is using the same tactics he's always used: intimidation, threats, and abuse of power. But this time, he's dealing with people who aren't afraid to fight back." Marcus announced that he was forming a legal defense fund to help protect the witnesses who were speaking out against Crawford. He also revealed that he'd been contacted by several major news organizations who were interested in expanding the investigation into industry-wide safety issues. The battle lines were drawn. On one side stood Crawford and his powerful allies, armed with expensive lawyers and industry connections. On the other side were the victims of his reckless behavior, supported by a growing movement of people who demanded accountability and change. The outcome of this confrontation would determine not just the fate of everyone involved, but the future of safety standards in an industry that had operated with impunity for far too long. The zombies that had terrorized Heritage Square were just the beginning of a much larger story about power, corruption, and the courage required to stand up to bullies who believe they're untouchable. As the legal war intensified, Marcus realized that the real battle was just beginning. Crawford's counterattack revealed the depth of his connections and the lengths he was willing to go to protect his reputation and career. The lawsuits were filed simultaneously in multiple jurisdictions, each claiming different types of damages and seeking different remedies. Crawford's legal team had clearly spent considerable resources crafting a strategy designed to overwhelm his opponents with legal costs and complexity. Marcus found himself facing a defamation suit claiming $25 million in damages, based on the assertion that his investigation had destroyed Crawford's reputation and cost him future film projects. Rebecca Martinez was sued for breach of contract and theft of trade secrets, with Crawford claiming that her documentation of his emails and memos violated her employment agreement. Even Dr. Patricia Williams was named in a lawsuit claiming that her academic research had been conducted without proper authorization and violated privacy rights. The legal strategy was transparent but effective. Crawford's lawyers were betting that most of the defendants couldn't afford to fight extended litigation and would be forced to settle or retract their statements. The message was clear: challenge James Crawford at your own financial peril. But Crawford had made a crucial miscalculation. The Heritage Square disaster had generated too much public interest and media attention to be suppressed through legal intimidation. Major news organizations began providing legal support to the defendants, recognizing that the case had broader implications for press freedom and public safety reporting. The American Civil Liberties Union announced that they would be filing amicus briefs supporting the defendants' right to speak out about public safety issues. The Screen Actors Guild, despite pressure from studio executives, voted to provide legal assistance to the performers who had been injured or endangered by Crawford's productions. Marcus received a call from Jennifer Walsh, a prominent entertainment attorney who had built her career representing whistleblowers and industry reformers. "I've been following your case," Jennifer said. "Crawford's legal strategy is intimidating, but it's also desperate. He's trying to use the courts to silence legitimate criticism of dangerous behavior. I'd like to represent you, pro bono." Jennifer explained that Crawford's lawsuit had several fatal flaws. The defamation claims were based on documented facts and legitimate public interest reporting. The privacy violations were negated by the public safety implications of the story. Most importantly, Crawford's own actions had made him a public figure, which raised the bar for proving defamation. "We're not just going to defend against his lawsuits," Jennifer explained. "We're going to file countersuits for abuse of process, harassment, and violation of whistleblower protection laws. Crawford wants a legal war, and we're going to give him one." The counteroffensive began with the release of additional evidence that Marcus and his team had been holding in reserve. Security footage from Heritage Square showed Crawford personally directing the zombie extras to approach civilians more aggressively, despite the obvious signs of panic and confusion. Audio recordings revealed Crawford laughing about the chaos and expressing satisfaction that his guerrilla tactics were working. Perhaps most damaging was a series of text messages between Crawford and his assistant, captured on the assistant's phone, showing that Crawford had been aware of the safety concerns but had dismissed them as professional jealousy and creative cowardice. The evidence painted a picture of a director who had been fully aware of the risks but had proceeded anyway, prioritizing his artistic vision over public safety. The recordings were particularly damaging because they showed Crawford's callous attitude toward the people who had been injured in the chaos. Public opinion began shifting decisively against Crawford. The initial sympathy some had felt for an artist being attacked by former employees evaporated when the full scope of his reckless behavior became clear. Social media campaigns calling for his permanent banishment from the industry gained momentum, and several major studios announced that they would not work with him in the future. The financial pressure began to mount as well. Crawford's current film projects were canceled or suspended, costing him millions of dollars in lost income. His talent agency dropped him as a client, and his personal publicity firm terminated their contract. The director, who had been worth an estimated $50 million at the beginning of the year, was facing financial ruin. But Crawford refused to back down. In a series of increasingly erratic public statements, he doubled down on his position, claiming that he was the victim of a conspiracy by mediocre talents who were jealous of his success. He accused the media of bias and suggested that the Heritage Square incident had been deliberately sabotaged by disgruntled crew members. The statements only made his legal position worse. Each public comment provided additional evidence that he was motivated by malice rather than legitimate legal grievances. His own lawyers began distancing themselves from his public statements, with several high-profile attorneys withdrawing from his cases. The turning point came when one of Crawford's own financial backers, a major entertainment investment firm, filed a lawsuit against him for fraud and misrepresentation. The firm claimed that Crawford had concealed the extent of his legal problems and had misled them about the viability of his future projects. "The dominoes are falling," Jennifer Walsh told Marcus during a strategy meeting. "Crawford's support network is collapsing, and his credibility is destroyed. But we need to be prepared for him to become even more desperate and unpredictable." The warning proved prophetic. As Crawford's legal and financial situation deteriorated, his behavior became increasingly erratic. He began making threats against his former crew members, suggesting that they would face consequences for their betrayal. He hired private investigators to dig up dirt on his opponents, and he began spreading false rumors about their personal lives and professional conduct. The intimidation campaign backfired spectacularly. Rather than silencing his critics, it generated additional criminal charges for harassment and witness tampering. The FBI opened an investigation into Crawford's activities, and federal prosecutors began considering charges related to the Heritage Square incident. Marcus realized that what had started as a film production disaster had evolved into something much larger. Crawford's downfall was exposing systemic problems throughout the entertainment industry, from the abuse of power by directors to the failure of industry organizations to protect workers and the public. The zombie apocalypse that Crawford had created in Heritage Square was indeed spreading, but not in the way he had intended. It was an apocalypse of accountability, sweeping away the culture of impunity that had protected dangerous directors for far too long. As the legal battles continued, Marcus knew that the ultimate victory wouldn't be measured in court judgments or financial settlements. It would be measured in the lives that would be protected by the reforms that emerged from this controversy, and in the courage of future whistleblowers who would be inspired to speak out against dangerous behavior. The final act of the Heritage Square drama played out in a Los Angeles courtroom, but the real action was happening in conference rooms and boardrooms across the entertainment industry. The Crawford case had become a catalyst for widespread reform, with major studios, unions, and industry organizations scrambling to implement new safety protocols and accountability measures. Marcus Thompson sat in the gallery of Judge Patricia Morrison's courtroom, watching as Crawford's legal team made their final arguments. The once powerful director looked diminished and defeated, his expensive suits unable to hide the toll that months of legal battles and public humiliation had taken on him. The evidence against Crawford was overwhelming. In addition to the documentation that Marcus and Rebecca had provided, investigators had uncovered a pattern of reckless behavior spanning Crawford's entire career. Federal prosecutors had filed criminal charges related to the Heritage Square incident, and the civil lawsuits had expanded to include dozens of former crew members and performers who had been endangered by Crawford's methods. But the most significant victory wasn't happening in the courtroom. It was happening in the industry itself, where Crawford's downfall had triggered a fundamental reassessment of how business was conducted. The Screen Actors Guild had negotiated new safety protocols that gave performers the right to refuse dangerous assignments without fear of retaliation. The Directors Guild had implemented mandatory safety training for all members and created an independent review board to investigate complaints about dangerous behavior. Major studios had adopted new policies requiring safety coordinators for all productions and establishing clear consequences for directors who violated safety protocols. Rebecca Martinez had become a prominent voice in the reform movement, using her expertise to help develop new industry standards for special effects and stunt work. She'd been hired by the Motion Picture Association to serve as their director of production safety, with a mandate to prevent future incidents like the Heritage Square disaster. This was never about revenge, Rebecca told Marcus during a break in the proceedings. It was about preventing other people from being hurt by directors who think their artistic vision is more important than human safety. The financial consequences for Crawford were devastating. The civil lawsuits had resulted in settlements totaling more than $40 million, wiping out his personal fortune and forcing him to sell his mansion, art collection, and luxury cars. The criminal charges had resulted in a felony conviction for reckless endangerment, making him unemployable in the entertainment industry. But perhaps the most significant consequence was the precedent the case had established. For the first time in Hollywood history, a director had faced serious legal and financial consequences for endangering cast, crew, and the public. The message was clear: artistic vision did not justify reckless behavior, and those who violated safety protocols would be held accountable. Dr. Patricia Williams had used the Crawford case as the foundation for a comprehensive study of industry safety practices. Her research had revealed that the Heritage Square incident was just the tip of the iceberg, part of a culture that had consistently prioritized profits and spectacle over human welfare. The Crawford case was a wake-up call, Dr. Williams explained during a conference on industry reform. It showed that the entertainment industry could no longer police itself, and that external accountability was necessary to protect workers and the public. The reforms extended beyond Hollywood. Film commissions across the country had adopted new regulations for public filming, requiring extensive safety planning and community notification for any production involving special effects or potentially dangerous activities. The Heritage Square incident had become a case study in film schools and safety training programs, used to illustrate the consequences of poor planning and reckless decision-making. Marcus had used his experience with the Crawford case to launch a new consulting firm specializing in crisis management and industry reform. His work had expanded beyond entertainment to include other industries where powerful individuals had been able to abuse their authority without consequences. The techniques Crawford used to intimidate and silence his critics aren't unique to Hollywood, Marcus explained to a group of corporate executives. They're part of a broader pattern of how powerful people protect themselves from accountability. The key to preventing these situations is creating systems that support whistleblowers and protect people who speak out about dangerous behavior. The Heritage Square disaster had also sparked a broader conversation about the responsibility of artists and entertainers to consider the impact of their work on society. Film schools began requiring courses on ethics and social responsibility, and industry organizations developed new guidelines for productions that involved public spaces or potentially controversial content. Tommy Rodriguez, the middle school student whose zombie costume had sparked the original conflict with Principal Hayes, had become an unexpected symbol of the power of standing up to authority. His story had been featured in several documentaries about the Crawford case, and he'd been invited to speak at conferences about courage and integrity. "I learned that sometimes doing the right thing isn't easy," Tommy said during a presentation at his high school. "But the people who support you when you stand up to bullies are the ones who really matter." As Judge Morrison prepared to deliver her final ruling in the civil case, Marcus reflected on the long journey from that chaotic day in Heritage Square to this moment of accountability. The zombie apocalypse that Crawford had created had indeed spread, but it